Welcome to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the changes and challenges we face and the great things that people are doing to make Greater Portland a fantastic place to be. I'm Christina Egan, your host. Climate change is a massive global threat that requires action at every level of government. On the international level, right now we have the Conference of Parties going on, but we also need action at the local level. How can our communities in Maine do their part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also prepare for the impacts of a warming climate? Several cities and towns in Greater Portland have been taking action on climate, and today we're going to do a deep dive into what one community is doing, the Town of Falmouth. My guests today are Theresa Galvin, a sustainability coordinator for the Town of Falmouth, Dave Lowe, a Falmouth resident who is chair of the Sustainability Committee, and Anna Paddock, a sustainability associate at our own Greater Portland Council of Governments. We are really excited to get a preview of this plan, which I understand will be released on December 15th. And so we're going to hear a little bit about that from all of these three wonderful guests who have had a big hand in shaping the plan. If you have questions for our guests, please call in at 780-4909. We'd also love to hear from you about the actions that your town is taking in order to combat climate change and prepare for a warming climate. So call in again at 780-4909. Theresa, so glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
And Dave, I'm so glad you've been working with Theresa on this plan. Can't wait to hear what you have to say. Welcome.
Thank you for having us, yeah.
And Anna, I know you're working all over the region on climate action plans, so welcome. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks for having me.
Dave, I'm going to dive in first with you. So we know climate change is a global problem. There's nothing really that one person or one town can do to really move the needle, but why is it still important for local communities to try?
Well, I think in Falmouth, as everywhere in the region, we've really started to feel the effects of climate change. I think there's no doubt when you look at our town landing, which is our where a lot of boats are moored, it has a profound effect. Some of the storms that we've seen, so we are all affected by this. On an annual basis. And I think you're right. We can't, our small efforts that we do every day are difficult, but as a town, we can have an effect regionally. I think we hope as a town of Falmouth, we can be a leader, show the way that we have dealt with some of the effects and are trying to make positive changes and hopefully be an example to other towns in the region. And I think if we all, as a region and then as a state, start making these small changes, eventually, the country makes some changes, and big meetings like COP28 that you just mentioned happen, and we all start making a dent in the climate change issue.
It makes me remember the story about the little girl who goes out onto the beach with all the starfish that are up on the beach and about to die, and someone says, "You can't do anything about it." She throws one in and says, "Well, that one's life just changed," right?
You got it.
So the same kind of thing of trying to have all of the different towns taking action to add up to a bigger impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Anna, you've been working with a lot of different towns. We know South Portland and Portland have a climate action plan, One Climate Future. And Falmouth, is it going to be the next one for our region that will be published?
Yes, Falmouth is going to be the next climate action plan for our region. And GPCOG is currently working on climate action plans for Brunswick, Cape Elizabeth, Freeport, North Yarmouth, and Yarmouth. So we have a lot of exciting things coming up in the region.
Give us a sense of how far along the different communities are in their climate action process.
So Brunswick, Freeport, and Yarmouth are quite far along. They're all beginning to work on the action phase of their plan, developing the actions and strategies that will be in the final plan. And Cape Elizabeth and North Yarmouth are a little bit, they're just beginning. Cape Elizabeth just had their first workshop, and they're both still in the data collection phase.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Theresa, so Anna's telling us a little bit about strategies and priorities. Tell us in general, what is a climate action plan for a municipality? Give us a sense of what that is, what it means.
Well, we've been working with GPCOG for close to 2 years now on this planning process, and we involved a lot of different stakeholders, surrounding towns, organizations within the town, of course, all of our community members and all of the staff. And we've had workshops and public meetings and all sorts of events to try to garner interest and get feedback from our community, because that was really our most important goal was to make sure that we were hearing what was important to our community members. And so the Climate Action Plan is basically a comprehensive plan or a roadmap for, we're looking at the next 20 years of implementation of it. And it's going to guide the town in decisions towards making the town just more resilient against the effects of climate change.
And sometimes climate action plans are just focused on kind of what the municipality itself can do as an entity. My understanding is yours is broader than that.
Correct. We did look at many different sectors. I mean, we're going to be looking at the municipal side, but we do look at transportation. We're looking at all of our buildings in town. We will end up working with local businesses. And then we are looking at that social piece. So making sure that we're looking at social resilience. So looking at groups that might be more vulnerable to climate change. So that is a component as well.
And I think what's really special about our climate action plan, because I've certainly looked at quite a few around the country, and not this isn't unique to ours, but in working with GPCOG, this doesn't just lay out broad stroke ideas. Hey, we ought to do this. We ought to do this. We got down to really the nuts and bolts. The number that pops into my mind is we specifically say in our climate action plan that we need to install 3,200 heat pumps by the year 2030 in order to meet our goals. And that's the kind of action that I think is so important, because the broad strokes, the big goals are important, but if you don't have actions that our staff, the people in town, can look towards, it's really hard to meet a climate action goal plan. So.
And that's great. On the heat pump side, just to dig into that for a little bit, we know that the state is actually exceeding its own goals. In the state's climate action plan, Maine won't wait on heat pumps. So tell us a little bit more about the 3,200 heat pumps. How many residences would need to install them, do you think? Do you have any kind of idea of how widespread that adoption would need to be amongst the homes?
Well, we haven't quite gotten into that yet. That's kind of our next step. We have that number, and we need to figure out not only how we meet that, or what the number, how many households need to do that, but how we're going to get there. And I think that's going to be partnerships with the state, partnerships with local installers. Obviously, we need to make this affordable. We need to make it achievable. So that's our next step, and that's what we really have to start tackling: is how do we get to that number?
Yeah. And maybe Theresa and Anna or Dave, are there other targets that you're setting in the climate action plan that are worth articulating right now?
I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, but a few that rise to the top for me are the electric vehicle transition and the vehicle miles travel reduction that Falmouth has incorporated into their climate action plan. The transportation is one of the highest emitting sectors in Maine. It's a huge contributor to our emissions impact, and Falmouth has addressed that head on, has an entire section on transportation, and they are planning on doing a lot of things legislatively, but also on the community level to encourage people to reduce the miles they're traveling in their car and to make the transition to electric vehicles.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Town Hall already has an EV charger. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
We have a couple at Town Hall. We have some at the library. We do have, it's actually very exciting. When I first started working for the Town of Falmouth, I was excited to find out that some of our police fleet were EV vehicles. I think we're some of the first in Maine to do that, take that kind of approach. So we really are trying to push that on the municipal side, transitioning our municipal fleet over where possible, and then incentivizing at some point the transition to EV vehicles.
I'm wondering whether your police officers enjoy the acceleration on those vehicles.
Yeah. Well, our police chief drives the Mustang, the EV Mustang, and I know he's a big fan of it.
Yeah, it certainly helps.
The transportation piece really speaks to how important this is as a regional movement. Obviously, we have a highway that goes right through Falmouth, and we can only do so much in terms of local efforts on transportation. So that's, I think, one of the reasons it speaks to this needs to be a regional effort to address transportation as a whole, whether it's EV charging infrastructure and other ideas.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the issues we face in Greater Portland and the movers and shakers leading the way. I've got 3 of them in the studio today. We're talking with Theresa Galvin, the Sustainability Coordinator for Falmouth, Dave Lowe, a Falmouth resident who's been working on a volunteer basis to try to make sure that the Climate Action Plan is shaped by residents, and Anna Paddock, our own Sustainability Associate at GPCOG. So glad to have them here today. And if you'd like to share what's going on in your town to prepare for climate change or to reduce greenhouse gases, please call in at 780-4909. Again, that's 780-4909. So I would like to hear a little bit more, Theresa, from you. You talked about engaging a lot of residents and organizations in Falmouth and hearing from them about what was most important. What were some of the things that you heard during that process of gathering input from people in Falmouth?
Some of the top priorities for community members appear to be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I think everyone's acutely aware of that is the biggest contributor in town. So that was definitely high on the feedback list. I think protecting our local environment against the effects of climate change is a high priority for community members. We are a coastal town. Like Dave mentioned, they see that our town landing floods during severe storms. So, and they're concerned about Casco Bay, all of our local streams and waterways in town. So that was high on the list as well. And that's important for us to look at as a town to make sure that our municipal infrastructure is strong and resilient towards flooding and all sorts of other climate effects. And
are there other things
think
that
of
you heard
other
as themes?
One thing I was really happy to see in Falmouth's plan was in the social resilience piece. Falmouth is focusing a lot of their efforts on preparing residents, acknowledging that the hazards of climate change are real and are coming, and we need to do things to be prepared for those impacts. Falmouth made a commitment to have all of its residents near a heating center and a cooling center in the next couple decades. And I think that is really inspirational and speaks to their commitment to preparing for all aspects of climate change.
And Anna, I'll just follow up a little bit on that because some folks are more vulnerable to climate impacts than others. Did you find in Falmouth that there were certain segments of the population that the town needs to focus on protecting the most?
Yeah. The 65-year-old plus population are more susceptible to heat-related health impacts from heat stroke or heat stress. So Falmouth identified that in the vulnerability assessment and followed that up in their climate action plan, with that cooling center to make sure that residents that are at a greater risk of hospitalization for heat-related injuries have access to those resources in a high heat event.
Dave, from your perspective as a community member that was involved in this process, what kind of inspired you as you went through the process? Were there things that really stuck out that made you hopeful about Falmouth's future?
There are a number of, we have a bunch of residents who are involved in various committees. As you mentioned, I'm part of the Sustainability Committee. We have a Conservation Committee that really deals with the natural environment in town. It was inspiring for me to see all of those members come together and really coalesce around putting together a climate action plan. And we're very lucky. Not a lot of towns our size have a Theresa on staff.
It's true.
To handle sustainability, and it's a real commitment from our town council, from our town government, to have somebody on staff. And we're lucky to have someone as talented as Theresa to help us. But it's a real commitment. And our town manager, who's been around for quite a while, Nathan Poor, has really committed to, and these aren't necessarily items that are glitzy and glamorous, but we've just adopted a green procurement policy. So the town staff is really focused on when they make purchases, how do those affect the environment? So there are a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that probably aren't seen but are really important. And so I was inspired to see a bunch of those different efforts that I think really led to us putting together, which again, I'm a big fan of the plan that we put together, as I said, for a lot of the reasons that everyone's mentioned, but it's specifically because it dives into the details and really gives us this roadmap too.
Yeah. And Theresa, how about for you? Were there the participation from folks or the ideas that came out, were there things that really made you excited about working in Falmouth? Like, do you feel inspired, or do you feel kind of trepidatious, or how do you feel knowing that this is coming out next week, this new plan that's so ambitious?
I am very excited, and I felt highly inspired during the whole process. As Dave just mentioned, we have a very supportive town government. Our town council is supportive of this. They adopted this plan several weeks ago, and town manager is just always behind the efforts and supporting us every step of the way. So that's been wonderful to have that. I don't think every municipality in Maine is in that position. I do try to work closely with other sustainability coordinators in the area, and we all have our own challenges, but I do feel like I have less challenges in the town of Falmouth in that regard. And I also think that community members in Falmouth are passionate about their town, and they're very willing to connect with their town councilors and let them know how they feel about issues, and that's what we ask for. If you support climate action in Falmouth, contact your town councilor and let us know how you feel, or however you feel about it. So across the board, that was just, I feel grateful to be so well supported by staff as well as the town management. And then other than that, during the workshops and some public meetings, it is very inspiring to talk one-on-one with folks. Everyone has their own ideas, and there's a lot of expertise in Falmouth about climate change and environmentalism and that whole genre. So we take what we can get from folks and put it all into the pot and just move forward. But I do think that every community member in every town has a role
Yeah,
to play.
to play. Yeah.
So
let's talk a little bit about moving into that implementation phase. The top of the show, we heard about the heat pump targets, that there are targets to accelerate electrification of vehicles and make it easier for people not to have to drive everywhere they go. We talked a little bit about vulnerability, protecting Falmouth against flooding and coastal sea level rise. Are there certain things that you think are going to be particularly easy, like low-hanging fruit to implement right off the bat? We'll start there, and then I'll go to the second question, which is what's going to be really
The
hard.
harder question. Well,
Yeah.
the low-hanging fruit is municipal operations. Not that they're all easy, the actual actions that we have to tackle, but at least those are actions that we know we can get a handle on. So looking at all of our buildings and making sure there's any energy efficient as possible. We're in the process of working on an ordinance so that when new buildings are built, we have specific targets set out for how efficient those buildings need to be. So I think that is the low-hanging fruit, and it also I think is important. We hope to once we pass some regulations about town buildings, that in turn down the road we'll be able to have some regulations around commercial buildings in town. So we want to make sure the town is living up to those standards first. So I think municipal operations are kind of the low-hanging fruit. Again, not that it's all easy, but those are where we have real control over what happens. So that's Theresa getting in and really getting her hands dirty around buildings and operations, et cetera. So.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about is we've got a lot of new development that's going in across the region, and on Route 1, there's quite a bit in Falmouth of new development. And I'm wondering whether the Climate Action Plan or the municipality has started thinking about some zoning ordinances so that electric vehicle charging infrastructure gets built when we're building these new buildings, because we know that people are going to be mostly charging from home. And it's nice to have the other stations, of course, especially for long distance travel. But how have you been thinking about that particular future challenge of making sure that as more vehicles electrify, that there's places in new homes to charge?
Well, we've very definitely been looking at it. The state of Maine has passed some new regulations that towns can adopt something called a stretch code around energy efficiency, and there's some other regulations that we hope, besides that we can implement that would sort of require a certain amount of at least infrastructure for electric vehicle charging. So we're looking at it.
Yep.
We need to figure out exactly what it will look like, whether that's mandating a certain amount per parking area, et cetera. So yes, we're
To be
very definitely
determined.
working on it.
Yeah, definitely. Theresa, are there things that you think are going to be easy to implement in addition to what Dave mentioned, or easier, I should say, as you go into the implementation phase?
I would say I would have to echo what Dave said. I do think that we have more leverage with our municipal infrastructure, than some of the other items in the climate action plan. I do think that this might be further part of the question, but there are funding questions, of course. But as we look towards planning for a new firehouse or so forth and so on, we are definitely factoring in everything we've put in the climate action plan to try to reach our greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets.
Great. We're about to dive into what's going to be really hard, but I first want to remind our listeners that you are listening to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the issues we're facing in Greater Portland and the people who are trying to face them. And I'm here today with Theresa Galvin, the Sustainability Coordinator for Falmouth, and Dave Lowe, Falmouth resident involved in shaping the Falmouth Climate Action Plan, and Anna Paddock, who's been working across the region to shape climate action plans everywhere. So call in if you've got questions or want to share what your town's doing, 780-4909. Again, 780-4909. So, okay, what's going to be really hard, like as you move into the implementation, and require funding or require some help from the state or the region? What are some of the things that you think are going to be most difficult?
Well, I think it is going to be reaching out into residences and there's a lot of transition, as I mentioned, heat pumps, a perfect example. There's a lot of transition that needs to happen in residences to really meet the ambitious goals that we've set out there town-wide. So figuring out how to help residents there's certainly residents that could afford to make a transition to a heat pump right now. So we need to help educate them, make it accessible, and then the residents who are going to need financial assistance in that process. So we need to figure out how we can make this transition as accessible as possible.
Okay, sounds good. Anna, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about the transportation side? You mentioned before that transportation is a really big emitter of greenhouse gases.
Yes, it is. And coincidentally, transforming the transportation sector is also one of the most difficult sectors to impact because, frankly, it's expensive and it takes a lot of time to build up the infrastructure to make electric vehicles, really attainable and accessible and practical for the majority of people in Maine. So that is definitely a challenge that is going to need to be tackled on the state level, on the regional level. I am hopeful about that. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed relatively recently is putting a lot of money towards electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and Maine is doing a lot to set up rebates. So there is a lot of regional support that Falmouth can tap into, but that will be a challenge because it is going to take individuals taking the initiative to make that change in their lives.
Great. We've got a caller on the line. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, hi. My name is Rick. I'm on Peaks Island, and I have a couple of questions. One is I hear you talk about transportation, and I'm not hearing anyone talk about airplanes, which are a horrible nuisance over the island here, and they consume massive quantities of fuel. And I'm not hearing anyone address the issue of where is all this electricity supposed to come from for heat pumps and electric vehicles.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you so much. Would one of you like to tackle the last one first about how are we going to get the electrification that we need for all of these new electric consuming devices like electric vehicles and heat pumps?
I'd be happy to take that one. Maine is doing an excellent job at greening its grid and building electrical grid capacity. It has a goal of having 80% renewable energy supplying the grid by 2030. So Maine is already working on a state level to build that capacity for the electrification that these climate action plans are advocating for. So that's really how that issue is being addressed on a state level. But then also within Falmouth, solar and other renewable energy forms are something that's emphasized in the climate action plan. So increasing, that energy capacity at a local level.
Yeah, and we have worked for the last several years to install a solar array on our landfill, and that finally came into service this year. Something we're really proud of.
That's exciting.
So yeah, Rick, I think you're right. There needs to continue to be efforts in this area, but I'm confident that with new technologies, that the electrical grid will be able to handle the capacity needs. And I don't have an answer on airplanes, although I do worry about it. I think it is a big issue, and I do know that there are people starting to tackle the issue.
Yeah, and I know that usually aviation is not part of a municipal action plan. But I have done a little bit of reading, just like about electrification of airplanes, which is hard to imagine because batteries are so heavy, but I know that it's evolving. And our caller, of course, was from Peaks Island. And a couple shows ago, I had Hank Berg, who is the general manager of Casco Bay Lines, on to describe how the ferries are now becoming hybrid electric. And that's soon to come. And it's being designed and will be built pretty soon in our region. So it's pretty exciting to see some of that electrification happening. Yeah. So, okay, as you're turning towards implementation, Theresa, and this is going to be the last question because we're running out of time, but I'd love to understand how the town will be working with its residents to kind of build support for some of these implementation items. Some of them are going to cost money. Some of them we can be able to attract grants, as Anna mentioned from the federal level, but some of them are behavior changes also. So what kind of things are you thinking about in terms of continued outreach to your community to make sure that this action plan actually gets implemented?
I think the education and outreach component is very important. And I would love to have something like other towns across the nation have, something like an energy coach, where you can literally have a one-on-one technical meeting. As Dave mentioned, it's a lot for folks to take on, to think about transforming their whole house to heat pump, and how can you get the kind of assistance that you need to start that process. So that's one idea, that I have.
Very cool idea.
Yeah, yeah, that would be great. And then otherwise, just having more workshops, more, excuse me, I'm sorry, more training sessions, and just making sure that people understand what we're doing piece by piece. We don't want to overwhelm folks.
Right.
So, what are we doing on the municipal side? How can we assist with their transition from their gas-powered vehicle to an EV vehicle, heat pumps, how to put solar on your house? So I'm going to try to do it as personalized as possible moving forward.
It's a very retail effort that's probably needed.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Theresa. And it's so great because we got a preview before this is published. Can you tell folks how to find it and when it'll be up?
We are going to have it featured on our website by next Friday, December 15th. And we'll also be doing a social media blast around that. And I think if you just Google Town of Falmouth Climate Action Plan or Sustainability, you'll be able to find it that way.
Theresa, thank you so much for being here. Dave, Anna, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And I want to also thank WMPG, who collaborates with the Greater Portland Council of Governments in producing the show, and Joshua, our sound engineer, who actually produced it. You can reach us on Instagram at Let's Connect Radio. Join us next week for another conversation about the great work that's happening in our communities. Until then, be kind to yourself and to each other. I'm Christina Egan. See you next time on Let's Connect.